Thank you for joining us for the panel discussion around the return on investment of ethical leadership in business, organized by the BB&T Center for Ethical Business Leadership within the Mike Cottrell College of Business at the University of North Georgia. I'm Latasha Brinson, your moderator today. I'm the Marietta Site Lead for Lockheed Martin Aeronautics Company. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists to include Mr. Chuck Gallagher, Chief Operating Officer, American Funeral Financial, and President, Ethics Resource Group. Welcome.
It's great to be here, absolutely wonderful, and I look forward to participating in this distinguished panel.
Okay, Dr. Mary Gentile, creator and author of Giving Voice to Values, and senior researcher, Babson College. Welcome.
Thanks, Latasha. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm especially happy to have a chance to talk with the five of us.
Okay, wonderful. Mr. Joel Manby, President and Chief Executive Officer, Herschend Family Entertainment. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Latasha. It's great to be here. I also look forward to it. I had a chance to meet all these great and very smart individuals already, so I look forward to it.
Okay, Dr. Bruce Weinstein, the ethics guy and author, most recently of the book Ethical Intelligence. Welcome, and thanks for being here today.
I have to say I feel really humbled to be in this company, so thank you for including me.
Thank you all for being here, and I think we're going to go ahead and get started with our first question. So, Mr. Gallagher, what does ethics mean to you?
Well, every choice in life that we make has a consequence. So, making choices that create positive consequences, that create the life that we want to live, the life that we're proud of, to me is that core foundation of what really ethics is. I think I would say to the group, ethics isn't necessarily black or white. It isn't set in stone. It's making the right choice based on all the facts and circumstances and realizing consciously that those choices that we make have consequences that live with us now and certainly into the future. So does ethics matter? And what is ethics? I think it starts with that.
I think that was quite eloquent. One of the things I like to say about ethics is that we often talk about it as if it's around a set of requirements, thou shalt not, if you will. And I really like to think about ethics more as having to do with something that's more aspirational, that I think we're more likely to behave in ways that we're all going to be comfortable with and proud of. If we go back to the core and think about what is important to me, what do I value, and is there a way that I can make sure that I act in a way consistently throughout all the areas of my life to live up to those values. So think of it more as what I can do as opposed to what I can't do.
Right. I think that's such a great point, and our company has used ethics as a foundation to make a great culture. And because it's a great place to work, we attract the best people, we have very low turnover, and it's because we want to use it as a positive thing, not something that's just the what not to do. I think that's a great and an eloquent way to do it. It really does attract the best people, especially with today's generation coming out of college. They want companies that care about the environment, about treating people well, about caring for those who have less.
Yes.
I just think that's exciting for the future. There's too much negative about business in the press out there. There are a lot of great companies, and I think a focus on ethics can help even more companies get to where they need to be there.
So it not only helps with attraction, but with retention.
With retention, but it's also just the right thing to do, and it can make society a better place.
So here's the thing, ethics is important, the practice of ethics is important. What I've discovered in 25 years of teaching is that the term is such a turnoff that if you don't reel people in with the right marketing, if you will, or the right packaging, people won't even get in the game, so to speak. So I've been de-emphasizing the word ethics in my writing and my speaking. And lately I've been using the term honorable behavior much more, and I'll tell you why. We're here at the Military College of Georgia, and a friend of mine from Annapolis told me at the Naval Academy that ethics was taught there, but they almost never use the word ethics. Instead, they use the word honor to appeal more to the military ethos. And in talking with folks over the last couple of years, I've decided I'm not going to talk about ethics, ethical, moral behavior, but rather behavior that has integrity, behavior that is honorable. It's the same thing. It's just how it's presented to the world.
Excellent point.
One of the things, Bruce, in doing that I think is really important, and Mary, you touched on it as well, is so often we find in many companies the ethics and compliance rules, and people have to go through the snoozer programs that talk about, well, here are the rules. Well, the rules are one thing, but what motivates human behavior, and if I'm motivated by honor, because that's the ethos, now I have a reason to follow the rules, other than someone in HR and compliance saying, well, here are the rules, and we have to do this because we're required to.
If it's based on something in your heart and soul, that's honor or truth, then the rules don't matter as much, because it's always easy to find a loophole, or possible to find a loophole.
And in fact, what was Joe Paterno's first offense? He said, I did not break the law by not reporting this more aggressively. It's right, he didn't break the law, but the question is, was that honorable conduct? Was it the right thing to do? And I think we all agree that that was not.
At Lockheed, we have a saying, do what's right because it's right.
Nice.
And we encourage our employees to do what's right when no one's looking.
Right.
And to give them the freedom to talk about what's right, because it's not
Exactly.
always black and white. Sometimes it is gray, and sometimes it's very complex. But to have leadership that's willing to talk about it and dialogue about it and help people get to the right answer, I think is really critical. And that's what great leadership does, and what all of us are very focused on.
What is it that our managers, our employers, our team leaders, and even our senior leaders can do? And I always say that one of the first things you can do is kind of what you were just referring to, Joel, is this idea of inviting your senior leaders to tell what I call a learning story. This is not a success story. This is not, I did the right thing, I'm a hero kind of story. Because when people hear those stories, often they'll think, that's great, but I couldn't do that. He can do that, she can do that, but so instead what we do is we work with the leaders to actually think of a situation where they were actually challenged, and where they had to work through how to get the right thing done, and then to share that learning story, how they worked through it. And what happens then is that you both signal that you're not just giving the sort of the headline of do the right thing, you're serious. You're signaling that even the leaders are struggling with this. You're signaling that the leaders are willing to have this conversation in an open way, which speaks volumes for credibility. And you're actually teaching a few lessons along the way, because they're learning how you
Definitely.
worked through it.
Very nice.
Yep.
So. And what I like about what you said is that it starts from the top, and then of course in your company it starts at the CEO level. And I'm often asked, how can a company create an ethical culture? And it's a necessary condition that the leader of the company be on board. It's not sufficient, because you have to get everyone else aboard. But if people know that the leader is a crook or isn't committed to ethics, what's the incentive to create an ethical culture?
Yeah,
That's
you
such
know,
a
it's
good point.
interesting, that one, though. I always have a little trouble with that, because I think in the absence of countervailing pressure or countervailing messages, people often will assume the worst. And so I had a conversation, I had a dinner with the CEO, the CFO, and the COO, and the major strategy person for a public utility about 6 months ago. And they were talking about how the employees always assume the worst of them. The employees assume that they don't care about these things, and they do care about these things, and therefore the employees make unethical choices because they're assuming that the boss doesn't care. And they were turning to me and saying, but Mary, I do care, you know.
Right, yes.
And I was kind of saying, you know, but it's not enough to care. You actually have to communicate that you care. Maybe you're not doing anything unethical, but in the absence of the actual assertion of that, people are afraid to assume the best because they're afraid to be made fools of. They're afraid to be made vulnerable. And so I think if you are in a leadership position, you have a responsibility to make that visible.
Yeah, they may be concerned with that, but I would put forth that they have the responsibility. If you're going to be a senior leader, you have to be willing to be vulnerable.
Absolutely.
And I think Bruce's point is, it's challenging. And as the CEO, I feel a constant pressure of everything I do and say and how I act and behave is being viewed. It's a message. Whether if I take a certain type of transportation?
Right.
Do I fly
Right.
first? You know, all those
Right,
issues,
right,
just
right.
everything. But I have to be willing to be transparent and share my
Exactly.
failures, and I'm very transparent because I have a ton of them. But I think you make a really good point about transparency, but I also think the leader does have to be transparent and put themselves out there.
If I may, Joel, you referred to failures that you've had and that you've shared with the company. Would you be willing to talk about something and how that affected the company and employees for the better?
Sure. I've done it often. I mean, we've all made a lot of mistakes, and I do think it's important to be transparent. I remember one time one of our executives who failed in one of our businesses wanted to quit. I sat him down and said, look, I have been through a company that almost went bankrupt, had to be sold, but I learned more in that failure than I did in 5 years of success in another situation. Gave him the confidence to go back. I also share a lot about my own personal life, whether it's marital issues or issues with our children, to show that, hey, we are all human, we all struggle, and we all have ethical issues we have to deal with. I think it's really important to be transparent.
So transparency and tone at the top.
Mhm.
Excellent. Dr. Gentile, I'd like to start with you for our second question. As business experts, do you feel we should be focusing on teaching ethics in business more within our business schools? And tell me why or why not.
Well, given that my career has been focused primarily in the field of business education, it would be sad if I didn't think that it was important to do what I'm doing, which is in fact addressing the issues of values and leadership in business. But to be quite candid with you, if business schools continue to teach ethics the way they have been teaching it, then I would answer no. I don't think it's really helpful the way we have been teaching business ethics. And what I'm trying to do with my work is to suggest an entirely different way of approaching the issue. I always tell people it's about asking a different question. Traditionally, when we talk about business ethics in business schools, and my work has been primarily at the MBA level, we'll share some thorny ethical case study, and then we'll ask them, what's the right thing to do in this situation? And the students will spend 90 minutes and they'll discuss what the right thing to do is, and they may learn some philosophy along the way. They may teach them about deontology and utilitarianism. But I think the best indictment of this approach is a little story I'll share. It's very brief. When I was doing research for my work, a lot of people said, Mary, you should go interview this guy. He's the CEO, entrepreneur of his own consumer products firm, very successful, based in the US, privately held. And he's thought a lot about ethics in business. So I went to interview the guy, and he said, I want to ask you some questions, Mary. He said, I want to ask you some questions about business school, and he said, I'm concerned about how you teach ethics in business schools. He said, I was interviewing an MBA from one of the top US business schools recently, and in my interview with him, I asked him, did you take a business ethics class? And the guy said, well, yeah, it was required. And so the CEO said, well, what did you learn? And he said, well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue-based ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you decide what you want to do, and then you select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do.
Oh, wow.
Now, this CEO who was telling me this story had this little wry smile. He was kind of yanking my chain because I was the ethics lady, But there's a certain amount of truth to this because, in fact, these models of ethical reasoning were not designed to tell you what the right thing to do is. They, by definition, conflict. The whole idea is that they help you think more rigorously about something from different perspectives and see what you might miss. And so they don't tell you what's right, and then even more importantly, once you've decided what's right, they certainly don't tell you how to get it done. So it started to occur to me that what we really needed to do was to ask a different question. Instead of asking what's the right thing to do, we should ask, once you know what's right, how do you get it done in a business environment effectively? And so if you ask that question, then a whole bunch of different things fall out of that. You start looking for positive examples of folks at every level of the organization, CEOs certainly, but others as well, who have found ways to act effectively. And you've looked at what are the tools and strategies and the literal scripts that they've used. What are the kinds of rationalizations and reasons and objections that they always encounter, and how could they respond to those? And so, and you set up a peer coaching kind of experience. So that's really what I've been trying to do, is to encourage people to teach ethics in that way. And if you teach it in that way, you don't even have to teach it in an ethics class. That the beauty of that approach is that then you can be in your marketing class or your accounting class, and you can simply say, okay, we now know, what the appropriate way to report your quarterly earnings is in this particular situation, but you're going to face pressures to cook the books. So what do you do and say when that happens? And use the language and the tools. Don't ask them whether they should cook the books. Ask them, if you've been asked to do that by a colleague and you want to resist because you believe it's appropriate to resist, what kinds of arguments would be effective, what kinds of strategies? So I think if you reframe it as about action and as about how to get the right thing done, absolutely. But if you keep teaching it the way we have been teaching it, I'm not sure we're having the impact we want to have anyways.
May I pile on here?
Sure.
Because I'll go out on a limb. The worst way to teach business ethics in school is to have a class in business ethics. And what that does is it compartmentalizes ethics, and it suggests that,
Excellent point.
well, there's ethics and then there's other aspects of being a successful business person, as opposed to integrating it throughout the curriculum and having it modeled. Again, all the faculty has to be on board with that, or at least most of them, but spread out across the curriculum, integrated into the coursework, the questions that are asked. But it's not just business schools that are guilty of this. You see it in medical school, law school, as well, nursing school, where it's relegated to a couple of classes. Maybe once a year they bring in an ethics speaker.
Well, you see that in businesses as well.
Absolutely.
They
Right.
1 hour of ethics
Yes.
training, and the best companies I'm working with see it as ways to tie into their leadership development or some of their other kinds of activities as
And
well.
a lot of professions and in business, they're required to have several hours of continuing education credits in ethics. So they go, and this blows my mind. Every year when I do these seminars, I'll see people coming in at the end of the ethics seminar to get their ethics credit. And I actually stopped one seminar and said, sir, wait a minute. I know you weren't here at the beginning. The irony of sneaking into an ethics presentation, is that lost? I mean, come on.
Yeah.
No, I just needed the credit. I just needed the credit. And so thinking about it in those terms, so it's not just what's taught, but how it's taught. I
Yeah.
Agree totally.
Thank you,
I
Dr.
had the same
Weinstein.
thought as you were speaking. It can't be a silo. It's completely integrated. And the way we look at it in our business, it is the connector to everything we do and how we rate people and evaluate people. So it cannot be segmented off, because the truth is you're not in a situation that all of a sudden, oh, this is an ethical situation here and not here.
And no, this is
Every day
financial.
there's hundreds of situations you deal with. They all have some kind of ethical implication, or most of them do.
Yes.
So I agree with both of your points very much.
Yeah.
It's fascinating when you come from a non-academic perspective. I have to tell you, I was at a university in Canada, and I was the keynote speaker, but they didn't know who I was by design. And so we're going through the line, and one of the professors looks at me and he says, "What theory of ethics do you follow?" And I'm thinking to myself, this is a fun opportunity, a great moment. I said, "The theory that keeps you out of federal prison." And he didn't get it until I walked in and understood that, having been there and having made unethical choices, there is a practical application. And I understand what you're saying in terms of teaching it and how does it work and what can we do, but in real life, when everything's in equilibrium, life is easy. It's very easy to choose the ethical thing. It's when life gets out of equilibrium, when there is that pressure, that need that takes place, something happens unanticipated, unexpected, and all of a sudden life is out of equilibrium, and the nature of a human being is to go back into equilibrium. The question is, at that moment, what do you choose to get into equilibrium?
Right.
Do you naturally choose the ethical thing? Can you recognize life's out of balance, there's a need, the opportunity, there's going to be some opportunity to bring it back in balance, and how can I rationalize that if I can recognize it, I have a better chance of being able to make an ethical choice to bring it back into balance than if it happens and I'm unprepared for that scenario, and then life comes along. I don't care what you learn in school. If you don't learn the out of balance portion of it, you'll never be prepared for the immediacy of making an ethical choice.
So I would build on that. I mean, I agree with what you just said, but the way that business ethics professors have traditionally responded to the reality and the truth of what you've just said is that they have said, therefore, we have to create like a flight simulator environment. We have to
Right.
put people in these experiences where they're under pressure and then say, what would you do? And what we find is that people react just the way you were describing. They revert to what's going to help them feel like they're going to survive in the moment, which often means put your head down, quickly do what they're asking you to do, and hope that you can get away with it because it's just too scary and too hard. And so then what you're doing is you're reinforcing what we know now from the social psychology research is our instinctive behaviors, but they're not necessarily our best ethical behaviors.
Correct.
So what I think we need to do is to acknowledge the reality you just described, and then don't ask that. Don't do the flight simulator. That's sort of 3 steps down the road. The first thing you need to do is put people into a kind of laboratory, if you will, a safe space where you say, what if you were going to do the right thing in this situation? How could you get it done? And you literally have them work together by design to create a script and action plan and rehearse it. Because what we know from the research is that you're more likely to do the things and say the things that you've already practiced and done, especially with peer witnesses. And so what you're doing is you're creating a kind of muscle memory so that when you do get into the moment you're describing, you don't have just one response, which is quickly put your head down and just get through it.
Right.
You actually have some options. So I think we know what you've said is true, but we haven't known how to deal with that reality.
See, that to me makes perfect sense because I do a lot of work with sports teams.
Exactly,
The sports team,
muscle memory.
It's muscle memory. You know, if you've got to make the last minute free throw, you just do it and do it and do it until when
Your body knows.
Your body knows. You don't have to think about it. You make it. But we don't teach
We don't do
ethical
that.
muscle memory.
We act like as if it's all in the head.
Absolutely.
It's not.
And you're absolutely correct.
I agree with you. Yeah.
If I may say, I think the reason we don't do what you're rightly suggesting that we do is because the focus has been on conduct, solving puzzles, figuring out dilemmas, as opposed to character, developing the virtues that will sustain us throughout our careers. And what you said, Chuck, reminds me of what a jiu-jitsu master said to a class I was in. He said, I'll pretend I'm the jiu-jitsu master, even though I can't do that. But he said, people are always coming up to me and saying, it must be great to be so centered all the time. And you know what he said? He said, I'm not centered all the time. The difference is when I get off center, I know how to get back on. And I think it's through what you're talking about, the muscle memory,
Yeah,
practicing a lot. And it's really, they say it's the journey, not the destination, but that, in ethics, that really is the key, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
I agree with this conversation very much. We actually have very specific measurement tools to get people back to equilibrium because in business, if profit is your only measurement tool, then you'll feel all kinds of pressure to do the wrong thing to get to the profit number. But we also have just as strong focus on our guest score, our employee scores, and a behavioral measurement. We have 7 words of love that we measure as how you go about doing your job. And so somebody can actually have great guest scores, great financial results, but if they're a jerk all the time, or we've seen them being distrusting or unforgiving or never patient in certain tough situations, in their review, they will get talked to about that. Okay, you hit your financial target, great, but you're not very trusting, you don't delegate well, people don't feel trusted underneath you. If you're going to be a great leader in this company, you need to delegate better, or we saw you being very impatient, meaning you admonish people publicly and didn't take them privately into the tool shed to give the admonishment there. And so that will bring them back to equilibrium and say, this is what we expect. So I agree with you, and there's processes in business to help that happen.
Joel, do you find in your company with the 7 standards that you have, that when someone new comes into the company that's not been exposed to those, do you find that it's the assimilation of that person is pretty quick, that they kind of naturally with peer pressure pull into that, or is it a longer, more laborious process?
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. It's either pretty quick or they leave pretty quickly.
Okay.
And it's usually self-selecting. But we have asked people to leave because of that. And it's not for everybody. Look, leading with love is not something everybody gravitates to, but we basically say, this is our ethos, these are our set of ethical standards. If you love it, come work here. If you don't, I would advise you to stay away. In fact, that's my final job. Anybody who is a director or above, and we have probably a couple hundred in our whole company, if they're going to come in at that level, I meet with them personally, and that's my job. If you read these 7 words, and if you're not resonating with them, please don't come here, because you're not going to like it, and you won't last long. And but so to answer your question, hopefully it's a pretty quick assimilation. Although I will say, the things I struggle with the most are some of our great leaders who struggle in that area, and how quickly to move on them. If they're struggling with the philosophy and they haven't left yet, I struggle with that a lot as a leader, because they are hitting the financial targets, they are hitting their guest targets, and those are the tough, there's no rule, it's an art, not a science, but it's a great question.
What you're saying reminds me of a wonderful book by Adam Grant called Give and Take. He's an organizational psychology professor at Wharton, and what he discovered is there are essentially 3 kinds of people. Takers, who look at any situation and say, what's in it for me? And Ken Lay is one of the examples he cites. Then there are the matchers, quid pro quo. I'll do something for you if you do something for me. But it turns out in the long run, the most successful people in business and in life are the givers. People who say their orientation primarily is, as you say, unselfishness. Giving, but which coincidentally happens to enrich you in the long run, but the trick is that that's not what you go into the relationship thinking about. How am I going to profit from this?
Right.
At Lockheed, we have 8 words: do what's right, respect others, perform with excellence. And when you walk on our production floor, every single employee knows what those company values are, and they're able to repeat them. And that's why we try to make them simple, so it's something that they can resonate with and something that they can remember.
So how do they learn that so that it's part of their muscle memory, if you will?
We teach them at onboarding. And as a part of the orientation, we actually go through the values, they see them throughout the facility, and we actually challenge employees about them.
In what way do you challenge them?
You might walk up to someone and ask them, do they know the 8 words?
Oh.
Our company president, he talks about them during webcasts, the importance of them. And again, with it being so simple, it's something that, it makes it easy for the employees. And that's why we try to make it that way.
Yeah, we also have training programs, and not only do they go through 4 hours up front, then for the subsequent 7 months, they come in a small group session for 30 minutes, and they talk about one of the words, and then they get a review. They get a review from their people working for them, how they are on those 7 words, and so they get evaluation, and then they have to put a plan together how they're going to be better at these 7 words, or also their guest score and employee score, so it's not just the 7 words. But so they have to put an action plan together to improve their scores, which I know there's some debate on that, and is that a good way to do it, but it works for us.
So it's the employees holding one another accountable.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And without that, it's an ethos without teeth.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
It doesn't matter if nobody's going to be held responsible.
It's interesting when you have, as you have, built these into the performance review process, then it becomes difficult sometimes to figure out how do you actually measure it, but it sounds like it's actually through conversations.
It's more about the conversation. I'm glad you brought that up, because I know if I was hearing me talk, I'd say, well, can you really measure whether someone's truthful or trusting or unselfish? It's much more about the dialogue.
Yeah.
We actually used to try to do a 360 where we'd have the boss and the peer and the subordinate rating that person. It was crushing under its own weight. And what I found is people always graded themselves harder than I was grading them. And so the richness is in the dialogue. When they say I'm only a 5 on patience, I say, well, why do you think you're a 5? Well, I did this, this, and this. And I said, well, that's not really what they usually get it confused, because they think we're talking patience with poor performance, and we're not. We want high standards. We're talking about patience with handling a difficult situation, and do you praise in public,
Right.
admonish in private. But again, it's more about the conversation, not about the actual grading.
Right.
And
Which
the fact that
actually-
I'm talking about it and all the senior leaders are talking about it, and it's important to us and it's important to our owners.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes
yes.
perfect sense, and I think that the practice of that conversation is probably the most valuable part of the whole thing.
It is most because if you're just talking, if all I ask about is did you hit your numbers? When I was in the car business, all I ever got asked is how many cars did you sell this month? Did you hit your number? Did you hit your number? But I ask, did you hit your guest scores? Are our guests happy? Did you hit your employee scores? Did you hit your financial results? And are you leading with love? And how do your people feel you are doing in that area? We're asking all of those, and it's all about the questions you ask.
Right.
So if I work for your company, how would I know if people I'm managing consider my leadership in that area? How would they?
How are you rated?
Yes.
Well,
How would I know if I'm leading with love?
Our employee survey, which is about 25 questions, includes questions about those 7 words of love. Is your supervisor patient? And we have just 3 lines of definition for each of the 7. So it is 21 things. That's a lot, but they're meant to describe the word. Then they rate their leader in that area, and so you know what your people think of you in those areas. And again, I know all that can be debated of whether you should measure it, but it's more about the dialogue. But we do get results. We know by leader how they're doing, not only in that area, but we know by leader what kind of employee scores they're getting in other areas, their guest scores, and their financial results, all by leader. So you know where your problems are. I mean, I can look at one spreadsheet and I know where my problem properties, departments are based on those scores. It's really a good system, and now that we've had it and we've simplified it, it has a real rhythm to it and some momentum, a lot of momentum behind it.
Mr. Manby, earlier we spoke about attraction and retention.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking for some of your leaders or your employees, do you look for ethics on their resume or on their transcript?
That's a great question. We haven't as much in the past, but now that I have been exposed to this center of ethical leadership here, I think it's a really interesting thing to be more proactive about. Because if people have come up through college and they've thought about it and they're challenged in that area, they're going to resonate with our culture more, because they can't possibly graduate from this institution without having it more on their front and center of their own mind. So I think it would be a great thing for us to start focusing more on.
One thing I would think, though, is like that CEO I was telling the story of, is to not just did they have ethics on their transcript, but to ask them more of your dialogue, to
Right.
ask them, and so what did you learn? Because I think you'll learn more about them when you hear how they describe the experience.
Yeah, it leads to some great questions. Because what we haven't talked about in all this conversation is a lot of our discussion has been why it's good for the company, but it's also the right thing for the person, because I know in my own life, and I'm sure, Chuck, you've had the same experience, I have made my own set of bad decisions, and the most content I was in my life is when I adhered to my principles. And the 7 words of love that we teach at Herschend Entertainment, I use in my morning quiet time to look at, to say, I want to be. That's my definition of success, is to be patient and kind and trusting and truthful and unselfish and forgiving and dedicated. When I'm not, I feel a huge personal angst and lack of contentment that eats my gut out, and that's the kind of person I want working in the company. And I don't hear me saying I'm always doing it right, because I'm not. But when I don't, it's my own internal compass that's getting me back on track, getting me back to equilibrium. And so I think it's really, really important to get people who believe in that.
Do your employees know that you have quiet time every morning? And is that something that's valued in the culture in your company?
I don't know that it's valued, but I definitely have talked about it. Matter of fact, I was just on an industry-wide webcast yesterday, and people dialing from all over the world from our industry association, and I had a chance to talk about that we lead with love, and that it's also my personal set of values, and that I don't have quiet time every morning, but at least probably 5 days a week. And I got a lot of text and tweets and people emailing me that was the most meaningful part
Wow.
of the conversation.
Wow.
That I would be willing to do that, which shocked me. But yeah, I'm very open. I'm open about my own faith at work, but only because it centers and it's my set of ethical values. But we focus on behavior, not beliefs.
There's a fellow named Dan Harris who's an anchor at ABC News, and he had an on-camera meltdown about 10 years ago. And it led him to ask, what in my life has prompted me to go haywire on national TV? And it turns out his journey led him to something that he was completely against up until that point, which is the practice of meditation. And he has converted Diane Sawyer and Charlie Gibson and other people Barbara Walters, who said, this is ridiculous. Which he thought of as well, and you didn't use the term meditation, but it's the idea of finding, as the Kellogg Fellowship put it, a quiet space for disciplined reflection. And in your case, reaffirming the 7 values of your company. It's 7. I know meditation has this kind of hippie, new agey feeling to it, but I really commend Dan Harris's book to you. It's called 10% Happier. I don't get a kickback or anything from the sales of that. Just that and Give and Take are the 2 most profoundly moving books I've read in the last year.
If you think of it as just evaluating your life,
Yes.
that's really what, at least what the meditation is for me. I pray and I look at those 7 words, say, what did I do yesterday that was consistent to it and inconsistent to it? And there's a long list on both sides, and it's just a reflecting of the
Yes.
previous day. What am I going to do today different? I find it very centering on what we're about.
What about paying attention to how we feel? How important is feeling or intuition when we're evaluating what the right thing to do is, would you say?
And I think you just spoke on it perfectly, your internal compass.
Yeah, and we know from the research, there's an article, I always get the title wrong, by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Emotional Dog That Wags the Rational Tail, or the Emotional Tail That Wags the Rational Dog. That's how it goes. But it's basically that we do tend to react quickly in many situations. It's fast and slow thinking, Dan Kahneman. There's a lot of research on this now, but that we do tend to react quickly in an intuitive way, in an emotional way, and often people will use that as a justification for saying we can't do anything about ethics and values, because a lot of what we know about these quick reactions is that they don't always take us in an ethical direction. They're often out of fear. They're often out of, looking at the short-term costs rather than the long-term consequences. They're often out of groupthink. All these things that lead us to make less than optimal decisions. But we also know that these same behaviors can be trained, and that because of brain plasticity, because of our ability to rehearse and practice, as we were saying earlier, that we can in fact use the very things that often lead us down a poor path in the service of ethical values. So, for example, if we know that people are vulnerable to short-term thinking, they discount the future, is the way the researchers talk about it, then that means that when you're trying to make a case for a values-based position, you want to acknowledge that reality, and you want to think about what are the short-term costs, not just the long-term costs, but the short-term costs, or what are the short-term benefits of making this more ethical decision. It gives you a different way of framing your arguments. Or if we know that people are vulnerable to what's called false consensus bias, which is I assume that all the rest of you are going to do something, so therefore I'm going to do it too. So if someone's trying to convince me otherwise, then a very useful strategy is to demonstrate to them an alternate social reference group, to build allies, and to kind of say, look, there's 3 others of us who are kind of concerned about this too. Can we have this conversation? So you use the very decision-making and emotional intuitive reactions that have led us historically to, for example, behave in an unsustainable way environmentally. It's not because we're bad people. There are reasons why we do all this. It was useful to run away from the saber-toothed tiger and to look at short-term consequences. Because if I thought about, well, do I really want this tiger to go unfed? I'm dead, right? So there were good reasons why we developed this way. They were evolutionarily effective strategies. It's just that the world is different now. The world has we have quicker and longer term and larger impacts with every decision. And so we can use those same sort of hardwired behaviors, and we can train them to serve us in terms of our current reality.
I think it's interesting when you talk about the emotional intuitive, because I live that. One thing that really was profound is, so here's my internal guide, but in order to stay centered, we'll say fundamentally every day, you evaluate that. Well, if we can help employees, I'm going to start with that, but I want to go to students for just a second. But if we can help employees just be aware, bring from the subconscious to the conscious. Well, every day I need to evaluate myself on these 7 criteria. That's your gauge. Well, if you do that every day, or 5 days a week, you're going to tend to be more centered. So when that circumstance with the saber-toothed tiger jumps into your life, it isn't that the emotional intuitive is going to lead you someplace else, because you've got that center that tends to be reinforced on a regular basis.
Right.
And to me, that's significant. But one of the things I just want to jump into is, the question to you was relative to students, and is it good to have the ethics education? And to see it on a resume is one thing. To have a dialogue is another thing. Now, I'm going to go off on a different tangent, but I also want to find out, what are they doing on Facebook and LinkedIn and other social media? Because
Right.
It's easy to put it on a resume. It's good to be prepared for the interview. But what's reality in life? Because as social as we are today, our lives are pretty much an open book, and you can find out most anything you want to find out just by looking at what people choose to do. And that might be a really good indication as to whether there is, we'll say, consistency with the message that's delivered in an interview versus the reality
great.
of the life they live.
Excellent point.
That is a good point.
And what are we, from a business community perspective, doing to partner with the business schools to share those types of examples? Let students know that things that you post will remain there and they're permanent.
Right. I've been to university settings, and I've asked the question of students, is it ethical for me as an employer to look at your Facebook page? And the great majority of students will tell me, no, that is unethical. That's my private page. Well, you made it public. I'm going there, whether you think it's ethical or not. So if you were to uninformed as to believe that that's not going to happen, I'm sorry, not my fault. If you choose to make it public and it's going to be the drunken party, or you're an idiot like the guy at Florida State who decides that he's going to jump on a table and utter incredibly vile things, people will know. And in the day of instant information, it will be quickly disseminated. And we have to be prepared for thinking about, do we do the stupid things, or do we make intelligent decisions, because we have to understand that quick, emotional, intuitive choices aren't going to be hidden like they might have been 50 years ago.
Right.
This is quickly disseminated, and it's also permanent.
Yes.
Do you remember that James Bond book and movie Diamonds Are Forever? Well, the internet is forever. And to
Definitely.
prove this to audiences, I asked them to go to Google Images and type in their name. And they'll say, wait, that photograph from high school? Who put that up there? And it's almost
Definitely.
impossible. There's actually a company that's devoted to trying to erase people's electronic paper trail, but it's almost impossible.
yeah.
Definitely.
And I'm afraid that, and not just college students, but all of us, I just can't believe the things people put on Facebook, the things people will say, thinking, well, only my friends can read it. But their friends can read it also, and all you have to do is do a screen capture of somebody's page, and there it is. So
I think an interesting way to raise some of those issues, I recently read a novel by Dave Eggers called The Circle. Have
Yes.
any of you read that? Yeah, where it's basically a dystopic vision of what technology can mean, and it sort of talks about all the wonderful things, and it also talks
Yes.
about the negative side. It's kind of a scary read, but interesting.
I don't put anything on Facebook I wouldn't want a potential client to see. That's it.
I agree. To me, it's a living resume. Beyond that, there is no, I'm not sure there's a lot of value, but it is a living resume, and if you don't look at it that way, there's the potential for making quick, major mistakes.
That's a good term. Did you come up with that, living resume? I like that.
No, I did not.
Oh.
It just popped in my head, so
I think
it's
it's
not
great.
trademarked.
It's
So
perfect.
Okay, well, I think we're to our last question, and this is for you, Dr. Weinstein. What have been your personal experiences around the return on investment of ethical leadership or focus on ethics education within business?
It's a very timely question because for the last year and a half, I've been interviewing business leaders and employees from around the world to ask them a simple question. How do you evaluate the character of your employees? Or if you're an employee, how do you evince your character? And it flummoxes people because, against with what you do with your company, people say, well, I just assume people are honest, or there's no way to measure character, or I haven't really thought about it. If you look at job descriptions, companies are looking for one of two things or both, knowledge or skills. But you almost never see a reference to character in a job description. Now, what if you had someone who was the most proficient and knowledgeable person in a field, but was a crook? You wouldn't want to hire them. Well, why don't we, in the interview, bring up these questions and have the dialogue that both of you were talking about? Isn't that where it starts, at the job interview?
Absolutely. We have the 3 C's. You have to be competent, which you have to be good at what you do. You have to have character, and we define what we expect in those 7 words, and then we want you to fit our culture, which is part chemistry as well. But and we put that right out there. So I completely agree with your point, and most companies don't deal with it in the interview situation, but we are very upfront.
Why do you think most companies do that? They're uncomfortable, or they wouldn't? It's not on their radar.
I can't speak for others, but I do think that either they don't think it's important, or they're not willing to put down a set of behavioral values that they're going to hold people accountable to, and that's where I think the mistake is. And it doesn't have to be called love. Ours is maybe more controversial, but I think most great companies with great cultures have a set of behavioral elements that they do adhere to, they do talk about, and they do measure. But hopefully we have more of them.
I think sometimes companies are afraid to do it in an interview because they're not sure they're really going to get an honest answer. They're afraid that they're inviting platitudes, or they're inviting even dishonesty sometimes. It's like, oh, I'm an honest person, And one of the things that I've talked to some companies about doing to try and get around that, it's not that they don't care about character, they just don't know how to evaluate it. And is, how so many companies, especially consulting firms, will use cases in their interviews to ask people to work through a problem. Well, to use a case that actually has both business, financial, or marketing, or whatever operational aspects are relevant to your industry, as well as some values issues inherent in it. Maybe it's around managing employees, maybe it's about accurate and honest reporting, maybe, whatever, without necessarily naming it as ethics. You have intertwined issues, as you were saying earlier, they're all intertwined, but then to ask them to out loud work through the case the way they would work through a financial case if it was a consulting firm. And so then you're actually hearing people think through an issue, hearing what they're paying attention to, hearing what they think they have to worry about, hearing what they think you want to hear, and then you can actually ask some questions. And so I've had some conversations with companies about trying to build that kind of a case conversation into the interview, because it is a little difficult to just ask people, do you have a good character?
Well, what if I were to say, if you're applying to work for me, Mary, tell me about a time where you did the wrong thing and you knew it was wrong. How did it affect you, and what did you learn from it? If you could tell me a story in detail, I think I'd be able to tell if you were telling me the truth.
You'd learn a lot from that. In fact, one of the most powerful exercises that I use with giving voice to values is something we call a tale of 2 stories. And we use this with students, we use it with corporate folks. We have to adapt it for confidentiality, but we ask people to think about what you just said, a time when you encountered a values conflict and you were unable, you did not find an effective way to act on your values, but also a time when you did find an effective way to act on your values.
Yes.
And then ask them to reflect on what motivated them, what enabled them, what disabled them, how they feel about it. That conversation is a hugely powerful thing because it establishes that none of us are all good or all bad, that there are things in myself as well as in the organizational culture that enable or disable my ability to act on my values, and also that we're all capable of making this choice. So I think that's a very powerful way to do it.
If you think about what's a return on ethical behavior, and you're talking about the interview, not that I'm proud of this, but having made unethical choices that led me to become a convicted felon has put me in an unusual position on the interview side, trying to recover from that experience. What do you do? And what I have found is transparency is incredibly valuable. So, Joel, if I were interviewing with your company, in the first 5 minutes, there's what I call the get to know you moments. Most of the time, in my experience, I've taken the initiative to say, do you have a policy against hiring convicted felons? Now, that's an unusual question to ask in the interview. And people will look at me and say, well, either yes or no. And I say, well, let me tell you the reason. And I explain to them what my past is. Just lay it out. Because either A, you have a hard set policy that says, I cannot be an employee of yours, therefore I don't need to waste your time, and we need to be okay. Or the alternative to that is someone says, wow, this guy is willing to out himself, and that establishes a foundation of trust. And it doesn't make a difference what the relationship is, whether it's the relationship with your children, your wife, your business, your employer. It is a foundation of trust. And if you can't trust me, we probably can't do business.
Right.
So it's legal to discriminate against someone who is a convicted felon. I couldn't discriminate you because you're a man or a certain age, a certain ability level, but
Yes.
it's justifiable.
Absolutely
Some
it is.
companies have
And I
policies.
get calls all the time now. You know, it's been 20 plus years. But I get calls all the time now from people who have made bad choices and have suffered the experience of being a convicted felon, saying, well, what do I do? And the answer is do what other people are unwilling to do and be transparent. Because you
If
can't.
someone were applying to work for you, to be your assistant, let's say booking talks for you, and admitted that they were a convicted felon, would that give you pause for concern? Or
Bruce, the honest answer would be it's a function of what the job is. You know, first, tell me about it. I want to know what the circumstance is. You know, if you're an axe murderer, yes, I probably have some concerns. If it's a financial issue, I'm probably not going to hire you to work in a financial role. I was formerly tax partner in a CPA firm. I don't get financial jobs. Now, I'm the chief operating officer of a $250 million company, but I have zero connection, none, with the financial records. I can't sign a check. There is nothing that I can do. I have no authority at the bank. Not because I would choose to do something wrong, but because I don't need to put myself in a position that if something did go wrong, I would be in any way, shape, or form considered as a suspect. I recognize that there are always those consequences that take place, but the return on the investment for being truthful has been incredible. And for that, I am deeply grateful.
So how do you rebrand yourself once something like that happens?
Well, in my case, I started off out of prison doing what other people were unwilling to do. That's selling cemetery property door to door. Now, there were two parts to that. Number one, nobody wanted to do it. And number two, everybody breathing happened to be a prospect. And
Potential customer.
But outside of that, if you choose to then be the best at whatever your task is, whether you're cleaning the streets in the amusement park or selling cemetery property door to door, but if you are the best, if you choose that, people will recognize your competence. And that opens the door for other opportunities, and in my case that did. And 10 years later I was a senior VP in a public company, and people asked me because of Sarbanes-Oxley and Enron and WorldCom, how do you do that? And the answer is every choice has a consequence. So that emotional, intuitive gut choice that happened when I was way off center brought me some consequences that pretty well stunk. But a different set of choices based upon a centered value and on transparency and truthfulness, it brought me to a completely different place, which gives me an opportunity today, Bruce, much like you, because we follow each other around in a lot of cases, to be able to talk to people about why smart people make bad choices and how do you prevent that.
And I, for one, could easily many times have made a choice that would have resulted in an orange jumpsuit, and there but for the grace of God. So yours is a story everybody can relate to. Absolutely.
And even if they can't, I would take truthfulness another step further. It's not just right versus wrong. It is also candor with your employees. And I see that as a problem a lot more than the black and white, did you steal or did you lie or did you cheat? It's usually, I'm not being honest with a poor performer, and they are dragging down the organization, and I'm building around that person, and that causes that's bad in a number of regards. So I think truthfulness is an incredibly deep and rich word that can go from black and white, right and wrong, to are you being candid with somebody to make them better, to maybe help them find another career if this isn't the right one for them. And I actually find that one of the most difficult words of our 7 leading with love words is being candid and really truthful.
It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to do, but yet, I think probably for everyone sitting here, when that person in our lives has been candid,
Right.
and told us, Chuck, you're screwing up. You might want to rethink this, buddy. Or whatever that circumstance, more times than not, those tend to be the experiences that we'll remember and that have been the most rich for us.
And the leaders that you'll remember.
Absolutely.
School teacher, parent, boss who did that for you, they're always the best ones.
Right. Right.
I think that's it for our questions. I'd like to thank you all for being here today with the
Thank you.
BB&T Center for Ethical Business Leadership and allowing me to moderate this distinguished panel. I would also like to provide thanks to the Mike Cottrell College of Business, University of North Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
for having us.
Latasha.
Absolutely.
Thanks.